Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Delighted to be with you today. Extra delighted. Jimmy Akin is here with us both hours. So you are welcome to call with your questions. It's Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin, 888-318-7884. If you were looking at your schedule and it says Carlo Broussard, then you can blame the snow. And the weather has changed things around for us. So Jimmy here with us. Maybe we'll get Carlo on later in the week. But in any case, we'll do Ask Me Anything. And you're welcome to ask whatever you'd like. 888-318-7884. You don't have to be Catholic to call. Jimmy Akin is senior apologist here at Catholic Answers. He is the guy who makes Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and the Jimmy Akin podcast, the author of a whole bunch of books, including A Daily Defense, 365 Days Plus One to Becoming a Better Apologist. The Bible is a Catholic book, all kinds of things. Hello, Jimmy Akin.
Hello, Cyril Kellett. How are you doing?
I am doing very well. I guess you are about to get your own snow there in Arkansas, huh?
Oh, no, we're not about to. We're getting it right now.
Oh, it's coming down.
Coming down quite hard, and we're supposed to get 7 or 8 inches, and it's supposed to get down to 15 below, so it's quite chilly here. And if that's the case here in northwest Arkansas, I would assume the same thing is the case over in Oklahoma where Carlo is.
Yeah, and but it didn't mess with your commute today? No problems with the commute in?
No, I stumbled out of my bedroom and made it here to my home office just fine.
Okay, very good. Very good. Again, 888-318-7884. You can ask whatever you like to Jimmy Akin. And we really mean whatever you like when Jimmy is on. 888-31-TRUTH. It's Tuesday. A new episode dropped yesterday of the Jimmy Akin podcast.
You got it.
I finally got it.
Begin and end the week with podcasts. Yeah. So yesterday on the Jimmy Akin podcast, it was on a controversial question that shouldn't be controversial, but it is. Do Muslims worship God? And in this, I quote from a pope, one of the great reforming popes of the Middle Ages, who answers that question for us, and I show you what he had to say on it. And if you're one of those folks who say, oh, Muslims and Christians just worship different gods, what has been part of Catholic tradition for a very long time will surprise you.
Oh, all right.
That was the Jimmy Akin podcast. I also had a new episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on Friday, and that was on the Immaculate Constellation Unacknowledged Special Access Program that Congress has reportedly not been properly briefed on, and that deals with UFOs. Coming up this Friday on Mysterious World, I'm going to have the first of a 2-part look at the history of the USS Hornet, which was an aircraft carrier in World War II and subsequently. And there are some very interesting mysteries connected with the USS Hornet.
All right. Check out, you can check them both out wherever you get your podcasts, the Jimmy Akin podcast and Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. You can check them out on YouTube, or you go to mysterious.fm for Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hundreds of episodes over there. All righty. The lines are filling up. I'll tell you what, there's one line open, and so you are welcome to fill that one if you've got a question for Jimmy. 888-318-7884. We'll start in Florida today. Eduardo is in Florida. Hello, Eduardo. You got a question for Jimmy?
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Good,
so it has to do with post-apostolic infallibility. So, like in Matthew 16:19 and Matthew 18:18, there is the binding and loosing, right? So I was thinking if Matthew 23, when it says that the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, kind of validates that this authority of binding and loosing, by definition, is passed down indefinitely and inherited indefinitely through the generations. Because I think Jesus is validating that for the Old Testament, which, if we are sensitive to the context, immediate context, that will mean that the binding and loosing for the New Testament was to be also passed down indefinitely. So we should find it in the New Testament, in the leaderships in some form.
Okay. So I gather that you want my thoughts on that. What I would say is that there is an element of truth here, but we also need to be careful apologetically. One of the things about the Matthew 23 passage where Jesus says that to obey whatever the scribes and so forth say because they sit on Moses' seat is that we don't really know a lot about the institution that he's talking about in his own time. We do have some later references to what it would mean to sit in Moses' seat, and it does seem to indicate a kind of disciplinary authority, which one could get from what Jesus says, do whatever they tell you. But we have to be careful here because we don't know very much at all about how this institution existed in Jesus's own day. And it's easy for Catholic apologists to take later conceptualizations of Moses' seat and try to do things with them and press them back onto Jesus's day when we really don't have the evidence we'd want to support that. Having said that, I do think that the idea of sitting in Moses' seat does convey the idea of something that has been passed down. There's a connection between Jesus's own first century and the people exercising this authority and the time of Moses. So there is the idea of a succession in this passage. And that also, I think, can be used to reinforce the idea. I think it can be reasonably used to reinforce the idea of binding and loosing as discussed in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 as something that ought to be passed down as well, that there's going to be a succession there. And that's something you don't really need Matthew 23 for, because when Jesus gives the authority to bind and loose, first to Peter and then later to the apostles more broadly, it's a legislative authority. And if it's the power to make and abolish laws for the Christian community, and if that function was needed in Jesus's own day, then it's going to be needed in later days too. So I think simple reason alone will tell you that's going to be passed down, but you can reinforce that idea by appealing to Matthew 23 and the successive function of sitting in Moses' seat that had been found in the Jewish community. There's going to be a parallel function in the Christian community. Where I think we need to be especially careful, though, is connecting this to the idea of infallibility. Because what we can show, and this is something you can show, for example, by looking in the Jewish Encyclopedia from 1906 and its discussion. It's online. It's at jewishencyclopedia.org, if I recall correctly. And it has a whole article on binding and loosing, and it documents the meaning of this phrase from other contemporary Jewish sources like Josephus. And it's clear that it did refer to the ability to make and abolish laws for the Jewish community, or policies for the Jewish community, and to administer justice in the Jewish community, like banning a certain person for misdeeds or things like that. But this is a legislative or judicial authority, and that's not the same thing as a teaching authority, which is what infallibility has to deal with. In fact, the church is infallible in its teachings when it teaches infallibly. It's not infallible in making laws or in policy decisions or administrative decisions. So I think we're cross-connecting two different categories here. And consequently, now you can argue that there is a teaching authority that's resident in the power of the keys, but showing that from the biblical text is another matter. And if we want to be cautious in our application of biblical texts and cautious in our exegesis of biblical texts, we don't want to claim that we can show more than what the text itself would mean in its ordinary environment. And what we can show is that this referred to a legislative authority. We can't show that it referred to a teaching authority. It may include that, but showing it is the problem. And so I wouldn't use any of these texts, whether Matthew 16, Matthew 18, or Matthew 23, as a defense of some kind of church infallibility, because I can't show that that's what these passages would have referred to in their original contexts.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. That brings us to the first break. Hey, right now we've got the Fat February $10 book sale going on. We've got bestsellers for $10. We've got new releases for $10. We've got a bunch of Jimmy Akin books for $10, all over at shop.catholic.com. 100 books, more than 100 books and ebooks on sale right now for $10 each at shop.catholic.com.
Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
EWTN, teaching the truth.
So I listen to this show as frequently as I possibly can, and I love it.
Just started listening to EWTN a couple months ago, and I pull phrases and words off of the things you say so that I can use them to talk to him. And I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much. It really is it's a gift to have this opportunity. And thank you for what you do. I mean, if you two didn't do what you did, then we wouldn't be able to get to express what we do.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Having fun. Jimmy Akin's here. Try to beat that. And, I can beat it. 3 lines open right now. That rarely happens when Jimmy's here. If you've got a question, it's an Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. 888-318-7884. Ricky's in Bellevue, Nebraska, watching on YouTube. We're glad to have you, Ricky. Go ahead with your question. Hi, Ricky.
Hey, guys. Thanks. I want to say thank you to you guys. After much kicking and screaming, I've actually decided to re-enter the church.
Oh. Who did the kicking and screaming? Was it you or somebody else?
Me.
Okay. I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you're back, Ricky.
Kicking and screaming.
All right.
Yeah. Well, so Jimmy, I had my question is more. Alex O'Connor was on the Jubilee. One atheist versus 20 theists, something like that. And one of the arguments that he makes in regard. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, just so you know, you're cutting in and out. So if you can speak directly into the phone and speak concisely, that'll maximize my chance of hearing the question.
Sure. Can you hear me better now?
Go ahead, ask your question.
Okay. My question is, atheist perspective from Alex.
You know what? I'm sorry to do this to you, Ricky. I got to put you on hold for a real quick second. Edgar's going to open the lineup with you and see if we can straighten that out. We're just losing every other word, so I can't make heads or tails of it. And I apologize, Ricky. Let me go to Will in Illinois. I am coming back to you, Ricky. I'm not hanging up on you. Will in Illinois, listening on the Covenant Radio Network. Go ahead, Will, with your question.
Well, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I served in the Marine Corps for about 20 years. And there's many people I served with who are struggling with the conflicts that we fought in over the past, 2 decades. And I was looking for answers of helping with healing. And I visited this church up in Milwaukee called St. Stanislaus. And I learned about this prayer from Father Peter Mary Rookie called the Miracle Prayer. I just wondered if you knew about him, his ministry, or any suggestions for us who served in the military and our families for healing the wounds that many carry.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not familiar with the gentleman you name or the prayer that he wrote, so I can't really comment on that. I hope that, if it looks like a prayer that that has promise, I definitely encourage you to try it and, see what kind of benefit it may provide. When it comes to healing in general, the church has a variety of things that it can either do or assist with in that regard. Now, you mentioned wounds left over from battle, and those can take more than one kind of form. There can be physical wounds, for example, and for those, Christ gave us the anointing of the sick as a way of trying to address serious physical issues. So if someone has serious physical wounds as a result of having served in the military, that's something that the church can definitely offer in addition to conventional medical treatment. Then there are emotional wounds, which are by far the most common. Even if someone comes through a war with no physical injuries as a result, or if their physical injuries all heal, there can be spiritual and psychological wounds that continue. Now, one way of addressing those wounds is through contemporary psychology. There are counseling programs and things like that, and that's something that is principally done not by ministers of the church, but by psychological professionals. On the other hand, even though ministers of the church are typically not psychological professionals, although some of them are, there's also a kind of counseling that can occur with ministers of the church. So, one could talk to a priest or a deacon and say, I have these struggles that I'm dealing with, and, even if they're not a psychological professional, they can still often give a kind of counseling, at least on an informal basis, and they also can provide moral perspective. They could provide spiritual direction in terms of trying different things and seeing what may help one heal, and they can serve as a kind ear, so to speak, as a kind of listening therapy to be heard and be understood by someone as you're processing the after effects of having served in the military. In addition, they can provide similar services for family members, of those who are of service people who, family members are impacted by these things as well. And they can serve as, givers of advice. If the family is having difficulties, they can often provide a kind of sounding board for how can we work on these problems? What are the resources? What are the options? What should we try? And so forth. Then there is also the sacrament of confession. Now, confession is specifically for things that are of a moral nature, where one may have done things either in the military or in any other context where one feels like one didn't do what one should have, and one needs to find healing in the wake of having done things one shouldn't have. And the sacrament of confession is there for that purpose. And also a good bit of counseling may take place in the sacrament of confession. Then there may, in addition to these, be Catholic support groups for people who have a military background. This would be especially the case if, there's let's say a Catholic military hospital nearby, or any kind of military hospital nearby. There may be a Catholic support group there. There may be support groups in the parish that could connect different former service people to be able to talk about and heal from their experiences. So I'm not sure exactly what options would be available in your area, Will, but those are some of the things that occur to me that would be worth checking out and exploring depending on the nature of the situation.
Will, thank you very much. I do hope that was helpful to you. We got Ricky back, so I'm going to go head back to Bill.
Also, of course, Rick, Will mentioned about this prayer, and the church certainly has a ministry of prayer that people can be connected with for various needs, including those stemming from a military background.
Thank you, Will. Ricky in Bellevue, Nebraska. Maybe we can hear you now. Let's give it a try. You got a question for Jimmy?
I do. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. I'll try to be as quick as I can. So, Jimmy, recently Alex O'Connor did this YouTube thing, one atheist versus 20 Christians, or theists at least, and he said that suffering makes God's existence unlikely. And he stated that because suffering exists, therefore it would seem unlikely that a theistic God exists. My question, though, to you would be, and maybe you can help me out with this, would that not actually work against the naturalistic view? Because would suffering not entail consciousness, which is something we would expect to see on theism, but would be unlikely to see on naturalism? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would agree. There are multiple responses to this objection, but one response is that suffering requires consciousness. If something is not conscious, if it's not a conscious entity, then it doesn't suffer. That's not to say it has full level human consciousness, but without consciousness, there is no experience of a subjective nature, and suffering is an experience of a subjective nature, and therefore in order to have suffering, you have to have consciousness, and consciousness is something you would expect on a theistic model that presupposes there is a consciousness that created the universe. Whereas if one supposes a purely materialistic nature, the idea of consciousness would be less probable. And so I would say that one response to the problem of suffering is that that you would expect consciousness on a theistic model more than you would expect consciousness on a purely materialistic model. In fact, there's even a debate among materialistic philosophers about, does consciousness actually exist, or are we all philosophical zombies?
Holy smokes. All right, Ricky?
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I think consciousness exists.
I think too. I think so too. I use it. I use it to think that.
That's what I'm currently doing with it. So I think that it must exist. All right, Jason in Dallas, Texas is next, watching on YouTube. Welcome, Jason. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, gentlemen. How you doing today?
Good, thank you.
Hope you're staying warm, especially in Southern California.
It's tough here, but I'm trying.
But I had a somewhat of a harebrained apologetic question to run by Jimmy or you, Si, and that's using pre-Reformation historical arguments in support of various Catholic doctrine and beliefs. And two in particular, I was discussing the Deuterocanon with a Protestant friend recently and said, look, there shouldn't be an issue here because the Orthodox denomination, if you will, also recognizes the importance of the Deuterocanon. So that's one example of a historical argument. Another one is a bit more harebrained, and that was I listened to a debate between a Muslim and a Catholic about the Trinity. And what was interesting is that the Muslim argument or perception of the Trinity, that it was God, Jesus, and Mary. So it almost seems from a historical perspective, that hearsay, if you will, that was the view of the way Mary was regarded by Christians as early as, in the 600s or whenever Islam was founded. So, Jimmy, do you have any thoughts on using those sort of historical comparative arguments in apologetics?
Well, there's certainly utility to appeal in discussions with Protestants. There's certainly utility to appeal into history before the time of the Reformation and documenting various things from that time period. Now, that may or may not, that'll have different levels of convincing power for someone coming from a Protestant perspective. And some of them, it may have very little persuasive power because they, in principle, adhere to sola scriptura, or the idea that we should do theology or form our Christian doctrine by Scripture alone. And if they're going to interpret that super strictly, then they may just cut out all historical considerations. But not all of them will do that, because some of them are more open. But some of them will. So it may not be persuasive to everybody. When it comes to the comparison of different pre-Reformation groups like Catholic and Orthodox and their views on the deuterocanonical books, I think that's a promising line of exploration. When it comes to the Muslim misunderstanding of the Trinity, though, I think it's less promising, because this was clearly a case where Muslims simply misunderstood what Christians believe about the Trinity. And although it does show a high regard for Mary, the fact that we're dealing with Muslims and the fact that it's such a misunderstanding will prove to be too big a distraction for many folks in the Protestant community to give it the weight it deserves. They're going to have a very negative reaction to that claim, and that negative reaction is likely to overcome what force the argument might otherwise have.
Jason, you probably can hear the music, so that means we've got to go to a break. But I'll tell you what, I think a copy of Jimmy's book, A Daily Defense, 365 Days Plus One to Becoming a Better Apologist, would be great for you. And if you'd like it, just hang on. Give us your address, and we'll send it off to you. Right back with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Why do Catholics pray to dead people, bow to statues, venerate relics? And where do we find any of this stuff in the Bible? In the delightful book, The Saints Pray for You, Dr. Carla Broussard convincingly defends the ancient Christian belief rooted in Scripture that the saints care for us, that they're our allies. Order your copy of The Saints Pray for You today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or visit whywearecatholic.com.
We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron.
On the next More to Life, no go.
When is enough enough? We'll help you set better boundaries.
That's on the next More to Life. Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest both hours today. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, about the Bible, about Jesus, about whatever you like. Want to talk about the moral life? Want to talk about philosophy? Whatever. If you've got a question, we'd love to get it to Jimmy. Just give us a call, 888-318-7884. As always, you don't have to be Catholic to call. Anybody can call. Now we are off to Michael in Buffalo, New York, watching on YouTube. Michael, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I have a question about a Protestant friend who's discerning Catholicism. She has difficulty understanding the difference between Catholic and Calvinist baptism, especially when it comes to baptizing babies. One of the difficult things that she has a hard time understanding is that if a baby is baptized, how would they ever know that they were baptized unless somebody tells them? And I was hoping you could clarify a few differences for me.
Okay, well, let's start with that question. Well, if someone baptizes a baby and then they keep it a secret from the baby, then the baby won't have any way of knowing that they were baptized. So there, in fact, are cases of folks who were baptized as babies and then their family quit going to church and they never mentioned, oh, yeah, we had you baptized. So there are people who either discover much later in life that they were baptized or never discover that they were baptized. So that's just a reality of life. What I'm wondering about, though, you said that your friend has trouble differentiating between the idea of Calvinistic baptism and Catholic baptism when it comes to the baptism of infants. Actually, John Calvin and most of the churches that historically identify as Calvinistic, like Church of Scotland, Reformed churches, and Presbyterian churches, they actually do baptize infants. There's no disagreement on that practice. Where you do have a few churches that otherwise subscribe to Calvinist theology that don't, it's like in Reformed Baptist circles or Reformed non-denominational churches. But when it comes to churches that are fully historically Calvinistic, they actually do baptize babies. So what tradition does your friend belong to?
I don't know the exact tradition. I just know she said she was a Calvinist. But
okay.
I know this is a big thing with her that she says there's just a lot of differences, that she doesn't really understand how it washes away your sins if you're not repentant as a baby. And that's mainly her difficulty.
Well, if you're a baby, you don't have personal sins because you're not a free moral agent at that point in your life. You can't make a conscious decision against God. Now, this is going to get into other areas, like it's common in Calvinism, for example, to hold that people are literally held guilty because of what Adam did. So God, would send us to hell, even if we've never done anything bad ourselves. He would send babies to hell because of what Adam did. At least that's a historic view. Now, today, many people, even in Calvinist circles, would find that problematic. But historically, that would be the understanding. And so Calvinists would say, unless you're an elect baby, then you would go to hell. But the idea of sending someone to hell when they didn't do anything personally wrong is unjust. And people have a strong intuition that it's unjust. And that's one reason that, it requires special effort on the part of Calvinists to try to convince people to go against their intuition, that God would just send people to hell because of something they didn't do. So you've actually got human intuition on your side in that regard. What I would suggest, and what I generally find persuasive in these situations, is not starting by trying to answer the theoretical questions in this area, but instead to show the biblical principles that are involved. Like, for example, if you go to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Jimmy Akin, I have a video. It's called something like Infant Baptism, an Overlooked Argument. But if you search my channel for infant baptism, it'll come up. And it kind of sketches the reasons why Christians began adopting infant baptism early on. It was in part because it even apart from the issue of forgiven sins, it gets God's grace working in your life. You get new life through baptism, and that's something that that Scripture is really clear on. It says it in multiple places. It says that in Romans. It says that in 1 Peter. It says that a whole bunch of places. And if you're a Christian and you've got a baby, you want God's grace working in their lives as early as possible. And so the natural thing to do for a loving parent would be to baptize your baby, unless there were some compelling reason not to. And there are no passages that say don't baptize babies. So given an understanding of what baptism does for a person, the natural thing to do, the loving thing to do, is to get your baby baptized as soon as possible, so God can start working in his life as soon as possible and not waiting until some later arbitrary date. So what I would do with her is I'd recommend that video to her, but then there are also a lot of resources we have at Catholic.com that could be a benefit. We have, a tract documenting quotations from the early church fathers showing how this was part of the practice in the early church, going all the way back. And we have another tract on infant baptism specifically. And then if she still has concerns after taking a look at the biblical, theological, and patristic evidence, we'd be more than happy to try to answer them. She'd be welcome to call herself, or you're welcome to call and ask questions on her behalf. Either one of those is fine.
Michael, I'm going to say thanks and leave that there. I hope that was helpful to you. Lots of folks on the line right now. Jimmy Akin, our guest, it's Ask Me Anything. Michael is in Des Moines, Iowa. Michael, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hello. My question is, wouldn't when God comes again be his third coming, since Creed says he died and rose again on the third day? So wouldn't when he rose again technically be his second coming? And why do people say his next coming will be his second?
All right,
okay.
Michael.
So the term second coming is not a biblical term. It's a theological term. And so it's not found in the Bible. It's something that's found in theology. And therefore, its meaning is not determined by the Bible. It's determined by how people use the term second coming. And when they when the term arose, people would think of Jesus's so-called first coming as his entire earthly life. So, from the incarnation all the way through the ascension, that's the first coming. And so that's how people thought about it. It's the first coming is this big complex of events that occurred over a period of 30 years. And he's not on earth in the same way right now. And so, but he will be in the future. He will return at the end of the world. And so people began speaking of that as his second coming. Now, that's not to deny that there are other comings of Jesus. He, for example, comes in the Eucharist. He also comes spiritually. He comes in judgment on cities like Jerusalem. So there are a variety of different come-ins that Jesus has, but the way theological language evolved, the second come-in was reserved for when he will return in manifest bodily form, like he did over the period of his first coming between, say, 3 BC and AD 33. Now, you could carve out a specific moment in that, like when he rises from the dead, as an additional come-in. But that's not historically how people thought about it, because they thought of all of his earthly life, including the portion after his resurrection, as the first coming. So they would consider that moment as part of the first coming. You can pull it out and say, well, we could consider this another coming too, but you would be using language in a way that other people don't, and therefore that could lead to confusion. There's nothing wrong with using language in ways other people don't, as long as you avoid confusion. So yes, technically you could renumber his come-ins in a different way, but this is the way that's conditional, that's traditional. And if you want to be understood, you want to follow that convention.
Michael, all that makes sense to you?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the call. We got to take a quick break. Right back with more Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Turn to Mary, the Mother of God, for help bearing witness to the gift of life with the National Life Rosary. Designed exclusively for EWTN, the unique centerpiece and crucifix represent the reality that all life is sacred and begins at conception. Help build a culture of life with the National Life Rosary, available now at EWTNRC.com. EWTN is the global Catholic network.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin's our guest in both hours. It's Ask Me Anything if you've got a question. We've got one line open for you right now, 888-318-7884. Heading up to Ontario, Canada. Deborah in Ontario, Canada, watching on YouTube. You are next. Go ahead, Deborah, with your question.
Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
My question is in regard to myself. I'm moving to a retirement community, and I don't have a vehicle. They do have Catholic Mass once a month, and they have communion visits once a month. On Sundays, they do have what they call Sunday service with different chaplains. Is it okay to go to that?
Well, there's no restriction on going to ecumenical services, so that's not a problem there. Now, it won't fulfill your Sunday obligation. Catholics have an obligation, except in special circumstances, to attend Mass in a Catholic rite. If you can't attend a Mass, then you want to attend a communion service, a Catholic communion service. And if you can't do that, then you basically, you don't have a Sunday obligation. So if there's no other way for you to get to a church, then I would say, well, you should go to the Catholic Mass at the retirement home. You should go to the Catholic communion service at the retirement home. And you're on other Sundays, you would be free to, watch Mass, Catholic Mass online or on television, and you'd also be free to go to the ecumenical service in the retirement home. That's assuming it's not reasonably practical for you to go to another Catholic Mass. If you're in a town like it says here, you're in Ontario, and if you're in in an area where there are other local Catholic churches, even if you can't drive to them yourself, you might be able to ride share with someone. And, you might be able to contact the closest parish and say, hey, could someone pick me up on these Sundays because I don't have another way to get to Mass. I can't drive myself and so forth. You might even be able to organize a ride share service with other Catholic retirees in the retirement home. To maybe the retirement home has a bus and they could take a whole group of Catholic retirees to a Catholic Mass at a nearby parish. I don't know if those are possibilities, but if I was moving into a retirement home, there are things I would explore. However, if it's not practical on a given Sunday for you to go to Mass, then you don't have an obligation to go on that Sunday or on those Sundays.
Okay, yeah, that is a good idea, though, in regard to contacting the parish to see if somebody could pick me up to attend Mass, and also for other retirees, if maybe we got together and did ask if the bus could take us. Those are good options. Yeah, those are good ideas.
Awesome. Very good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, where are we going now? Let's go to Joe in Peachtree, Georgia, watching on YouTube.
Question.
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
So my question has to do with the incarnation of Christ. I'm curious if it's possible that Christ could have come in another avatar, for example, maybe being interpreted through a different cultural lens, let's say to India. Is there any kind of truth or related to that question?
Well, you ask, is it possible that this could have happened? And, well, God is omnipotent, so he can do anything that doesn't involve a logical contradiction. And so, yeah, it's possible that he could have come in a different cultural context than besides to the Jewish people. He could have done that. Whether now in our timeline, he did incarnate as a Jewish person. It's possible that in another timeline, God might have chosen to use a different people as his chosen people. And rather than become a Jew, he might have been incarnated into another people. It's also possible that he could incarnate in both the Jewish people and in another people. So those are hypothetical possibilities. Now, if you're asking about what happened in the real world, I would have to say, well, I can't limit God's omnipotence and say God didn't do things. I mean, God does hidden stuff that he doesn't tell us about all the time. But we have no evidence that Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, ever incarnated apart from his incarnation as Jesus of Nazareth. And since we have no evidence that that happened, I wouldn't pursue exploring that because one could get misled and one would be basically, to my mind, wasting time on possibilities that we have no evidence for.
All right. I'm going to leave that there, too, because we're coming near the end of the hour. Joe, thank you. I hope that was helpful to you. Nate's in North Carolina, also watching on YouTube. Nate, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hey, Jimmy. Hey, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a note for the listening audience. There's no need to ask, can you hear me? Because if we can't, we'll tell you.
Well, I appreciate that. Hey, thanks for taking the time. Quick question, kind of well, maybe not so quick, but we'll see. Philosophical question about the church's teaching on contraception, how it's disordered. My question is, if the church's teaching is true on contraception, would that make other forms of technology that we've advanced in human civilization, would that make it also wrong? Like, it seems, in my head, some logical inconsistencies, like why is it okay for us to drive cars? We have legs, we should use that, or get a stent in our heart, or, there's all sorts of things that we use that's not necessarily natural and ordered towards, maybe some greater end. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so the issue is not naturalness. The issue is, what does the technology do? For example, Psychelet, let's suppose I invented a device that its purpose was to chop off your foot. Okay, so I've got this foot chopper. Would all things being equal, would you say that it would be moral or immoral for me to use my foot chopper to chop off your foot?
So immoral. Come on, leave my foot alone.
Yeah, exactly. Because what I'm doing there is I'm harming your body. I'm harming its natural function. On the other hand, let's suppose you've got a heart arrhythmia and your heart is not beating in time the way it should. So I propose a different device. I say, instead of chopping off your foot, why don't I install a pacemaker to restore your heart's normal rhythm? Would that be moral or immoral?
That's. I hope it's moral. I want it if I'm having trouble. Yes, that sounds
okay.
Moral.
So yeah, that's the basic difference. It's the issue isn't naturalness versus technology. The issue is, what are you doing with the technology? Are you assisting natural function, as in the case of a pacemaker, or are you destroying natural function, as in the case of a foot chopper, or something that sterilizes you, either temporarily or permanently, and thus interferes with your body's natural function? That's the basic difference.
Now, I'll tell you what, I'll come back to. I'm anxious to hear whether that makes sense to you or not, Nate.
Let me also address one other thing, because Nate raised a related question about, well, like, what about using cars instead of feet to go somewhere. Well, I would say in some cases, using your feet rather than a car is the thing you should do. I don't need to go out and check my mail. I don't need to drive my car across the street to my mailbox. I mean, I could, but the cost benefit analysis is it would benefit more for me to just, rather than get out the car and go drive, to just do it myself using my Mark 1.0 human legs. On the other hand, if I need to get to the hospital, then I think the thing to do would be to probably take a wheeled vehicle because it's going to get me there quicker. And similarly, if I have other engagements that I could use a car for, that would shave time off of an otherwise lengthy trip and get more stuff done and do more good in the world and glorify God more, then using a car is fine in those circumstances. So so those are kind of the components to the two questions that Nate asked. When it comes to contraception, it destroys bodily function either temporarily or permanently, as opposed to assist in bodily function. And with things like technologies like automobiles, there's a cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes it's better to use your legs. Sometimes it's better to use a car.
All right, Nate, what do you think?
I mean, so I guess it just matters what ultimate end is it ordered toward? Because I don't know, I just get hung up sometimes too, where it's like, you hear about couples who are, exploring Catholicism, and then, one person's interested, one person's not, and then it puts a huge strain, on people's relationships. And it's like, well, would the greater good be to just, come together in some way, even if it's not the way that the church teaches? That's where I kind of get a little hung up. Is like, what ordered towards, if it's ordered towards the good, I don't know.
Nate, I'm not sure what you're asking. And we're right down to the end of the show. So tell you what, if you have a follow-up question, by all means, think about how you can express it concisely and call back, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. Okay.
I'm sorry. I put Nate on hold because I thought we were going to the next call. So I will say okay for Nate. Nate, thanks. I'm going to go to Rebecca in Mississippi real quick. If we can do that by the top of the hour. Rebecca, go ahead with your question.
Hey, I had a question about an episode cald Haunted Dolls that you did. It's an old episode, and
what was it called?
God allowed Haunted Dolls.
Oh, okay.
It's about 5 years old. But you said that God allowed polygamy, and I wondered, did he allow it as in it's just fine to do that at that time, or was it in his permissive will, like all evil things that happen to us or that we do? And I also have a second question if you have time.
Okay, so in answer to the first question, the church doesn't have a teaching on this. There are passages in the Bible that would suggest that polygamy could have a positive value and even be a reward from God. But on the other hand, there are passages that would indicate that could be taken to indicate that polygamy was always a problem. And so how you weight those passages is going to come down to the individual interpreter, and the church doesn't have an official teaching on that. What it does teach is that polygamy is not for today. But when you look at the Old Testament and the status of polygamy in that, different interpreters are going to have different views. What's your second question?
So I've been watching Doctor Who, and I found your episodes with Dom, and I wondered if you were ever going to do any more of those.
Oh, so if I heard correctly, you said you found my episodes with Dom, and the answer is yes. We do a weekly podcast called Secrets of Doctor Who. It's at the StarQuest production network, which is sqpn.com, or if you go to any podcast app and type in Secrets of Doctor Who, we're regularly producing new episodes of that every week.
I'll tell you what, Rebecca, because we have come to the end of the hour, I got to leave it there. But I'd like to send you a copy of Jimmy's book, A Daily Defense, 365 Days Plus One to Becoming a Better Apologist. If you'd like it, just hang on the line and you can get it. And anybody that's looking for Jimmy Akin episodes, Mysterious.fm, YouTube, just anywhere you get your podcasts, Jimmy Akin all over the podcasting world. You can find lots of episodes. We have to take a very quick break. We're coming right back, though. So if you're on the line, hang on the line. If you haven't called yet, you're welcome to call 888-318-7884. It's Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Whatever the question is, we'll do our very best to get an answer from Jimmy for you. That'll do it for us for just a few minutes. We'll be right back with more Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host, and maybe you get used to Jimmy Akin on a Friday now, and Joe on a Wednesday, and Dr. Carlo Broussard on a Tuesday. We do that on purpose. We want you to have it to be predictable. But this week, we couldn't predict the weather, and snow has kept Dr. Broussard off the air. Jimmy Akin here with us for this Tuesday afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And if you would like to ask a question, you are welcome to call 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. We'll do our very best to get you on with Jimmy. And there are 2 lines open right now. We got 6 on this phone, and 2 of them are open right now. So go ahead and dial. We will start out this hour.
So all this Dr. Carlo Broussard stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I grew up in an academic family, and Carlo has an earned doctorate, and that means something. I don't use the title doctor for people who have fake doctorates, like James White, for example. But I've known Carlo for years, and he's always been Carlo to me.
I know it's hard.
So if you're going to be doctoring him, I may insist on my title. I am Mr., which is of course a form of master.
Okay.
So you're going to need to start calling me Master Jimmy.
Oh my God, I'm not doing that. So
Like
I'm on the
Jedi Council or something.
Okay, all right. Well, that's not happening. I won't be able to keep straight all of you. So, Dr. Broussard is just going back to Carlo if there's an ultimatum. All right, let's go.
Just kidding around.
I know you are. Let's go to Leslie in New Orleans, Louisiana, listening on 690 AM. Leslie, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Master Jimmy Akin.
That meant to be. I'm trying.
Leslie, are you with us?
Hi. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. This is Leslie. Yes.
Well, you are on the air
so
with
sorry.
Jimmy Akin. No, it's all right.
Hey, Jimmy. I'm sorry. I'm right outside of church. I'm right outside of Mass. So I'm just.
That's okay. What's your question, Leslie?
The phrase agree to disagree. When you are in debate or when I'm in discussion with someone about our faith, they're actually fallen away Catholics, and they'll say something in opposition to the church, and that's why they're quote unquote not Catholic anymore. And then I explain to them or debate a particular thing. And, just maybe after the first comment I make, they'll just automatically say, well, we're going to agree to disagree. Like, they come right out and say, this is what we're going to do. How do I respond to that? I don't feel comfortable with agreeing to that.
Well, so what that phrase is used to do is be a conversation stopper. And so if someone says, we'll have to agree to disagree. Now, if they say it like, we're going to agree to disagree, then I'd say they're being a jerk because they're posing it in an overly aggressive form. And you have a judgment call at that point. Do you want to respond in kind? Because you can be snarky back and say, oh, is that what we're going to do? Which points out to them that they were just a jerk. Well, there's a judgment call there. As the book of Proverbs says, answer a fool according to his folly. And as the book of Proverbs also says, answer not a fool according to his folly. It has that's 2 verses that are right next to each other in the book of Proverbs. And what that tells us is there's a judgment call to be made. When someone's being a jerk, you sometimes respond in kind and you sometimes don't. And you have to use judgment to figure out which is the case. So if someone, aggressively says, well, we're going to agree to disagree, I'd say, oh, is that what we're going to do? That's an option for you. On the other hand, you may turn the other cheek, and it may be more to your benefit to help the person to respond in a kind way where you're not being a jerk to them. So that's a judgment call you have to think about. On the other hand, if the person uses this phrase, but it's not in a hostile way, if they said, well, I'm not Catholic because of X, and you then say, oh, well, here's a Catholic perspective on that. And they've heard you out. So they're listening to you, they're being polite. And then they say, well, at some point, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to agree to disagree. And they say it in a kind way. Well, I wouldn't be a jerk to them. I would take that as, okay, they're telling me that they don't want to talk about this more right now. And if I press the matter further, it's not going to be productive. You know, they're already telling me they don't want to keep going on this conversation, and it'll be counterproductive if I keep pushing it. Well, again, there's a judgment call of, do I keep pushing it or not? But ordinarily, if they're being polite, then I would not push it. You know, if they say, "No, I'm afraid we're going to have to disagree," I'd say, "Okay, you know, and if you ever want to talk about this more in the future, I'd be more than happy to," and leave it at that. Because there are situations where it's just not practical to keep going on a conversation. And, you know, Catholics too can be in situations where they need to say, "Oh, I'm afraid we'll have to agree to disagree," because it's just not practical to go on with the conversation right now. It's not being productive. And so I don't think this is really a Catholic versus non-Catholic issue. I think people can, whether they're Catholic or non-Catholic, can be a jerk when they use the phrase, or they can use it as a polite way of getting out of a conversation that doesn't seem to be productive anymore. So there are judgment calls to be made in how to respond, but in general, if they're being polite, I would be graceful in accepting their request not to continue the conversation for now.
Okay, Leslie?
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for the call and for the question. Wendy's in Wisconsin listening to EWTN on Channel 130, Sirius XM Satellite Radio. Wendy, we're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi. Thank you for being on the radio. I love your program.
Thank you.
My question, I think, is going to be really easy for Jimmy. I have a few friends who have sought the advice or the interaction with a medium. And I know that our catechism says this is not appropriate. We should not be doing this as Catholics. And some of these people are. How do I kindly remind them or show them the difference between that and doing like prophetic messages and those kind of things?
Well, okay, if in terms of reminding them, it is pretty easy. The Catechism addresses this subject in paragraph 2117. And so I would, if you just want to remind people, I would say, you know, I understand you've been talking to a medium, and you should be aware that the Catechism, expresses concerns about that. And it's in paragraph 2117. You can either give them the number of the paragraph, or you could even read it with them. But reminding them is pretty easy. In terms of explaining the reasoning behind what the Catechism says, well, you have to read the passage, and you have to read it carefully, because the Catechism is phrased pretty carefully. In the case of mediumship, it doesn't actually use the term medium. It uses the related term spiritism, which is the practice of mediumship. It's another word for the practice of mediumship. And it says, in part, in paragraph 2117, that spiritism often implies divination, or which is learning about the future through unethical means, or magical practices. And so so the Catechism says spiritism often implies divination or magical practices. The Church, for her part, warns the faithful against it. And that's what the Catechism has to say. So the Church warns people against spiritism or mediumship on two grounds. The first ground is that it often implies divination or learning about the future through unethical means, and it often implies magical practices. And so those are the two reasons that the Catechism cites as the reasons for the Church's warning against it. I would actually add a third reason against it, which is, this is not true of all mediums, but many mediums are fake. They may realize they're fake and that they're consciously swindling people out of money, especially in times of grief, when they, have a lost loved one they want to talk to, and the medium will use a combination of what are known as cold read-in and hot read-in to convince the person that they are in communication with their lost loved one when in fact they're not. And sometimes they will be innocently unaware of what they're doing. The medium may be committing fraud without even realizing it. They may think they're in contact with a departed loved one, but really they're unconsciously cold reading the person that they're talking to. And they're using this cold reading technique without even being aware of it. And I know of mediums who have looked back on their career as a medium and say, yeah, I was really cold reading people. Cold reading is when you deduce things based on who you're talking to. Like you look at their age and their gender and their ethnicity and their clothing and, things like that. And you deduce things about who their lost loved one may be. And then you ask them questions and get confirmation on some things, but not others. And that kind of guides them through the reading process. Hot reading, and you can do cold reading unconsciously. We all cold read each other all the time without thinking about it. But hot reading is when you deliberately research a person for purposes of fraud. So hot reading, like if you go on someone's Facebook page and look up material about them that you can then use to fake a reading with their loved one, that's always conscious fraud. But cold reading can be unconscious. And some mediums have looked back and said, yeah, I was just cold reading people. I don't think I was really in touch with their relatives. So in addition to the divination and the magical practices, I would say there's also a significant risk of fraud. This is something that was investigated quite thoroughly by scientists back in the late 1800s and early 1900s with, for example, the Society for Psychical Research in Great Britain and the American Society for Psychical Research here in America, where they looked into all different kinds of mediums, and they found that a lot of them are consciously or unconsciously committing fraud, although they did find some seeming exceptions. So I would say that in terms of what the Catechism says, it warns people against mediumship because it often involves divination. It warns people against mediumship because it often involves magical practices. And I would say it also could warn people against mediumship on the ground that that it often involves fraud. Now, someone could come back and say, well, I'm not using it for divination and I'm not using it for magic, and I have confidence that my medium is not a fraud. I have evidence why I think they're not a fraud. Is it okay then? And that's a subject that actually the Catechism doesn't address. The issue is complicated here because there are some forms of communication with the dead that are perfectly legitimate. Like if a saint shows up in an apparition, well, you can talk to the saint. And even more generally, the book of John says, test the spirits to see whether they're of God. The only way to test them is to talk to them. So if a spirit shows up and takes the initiative, if it's an after-death communication or an apparition or something like that, well, then you can't talk to them. So there's a line here that the church has not precisely defined, at least not as of yet. So the church warns people against mediumship, but it hadn't yet answered every conceivable question in this area.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave it there, Wendy. I hope that was what you were looking for. I hope that was helpful to you, but we got to take the break. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything on Catholic Answers Live.
Your questions, Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
This is Jim Pinto, Director of EWTN Media Missionaries. Mother Angelica said, "The essence of evangelization is to tell everybody Jesus loves you." You can help EWTN share the good news by becoming a media missionary. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today and join us in sharing the eternal word with the world.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything. All the lines full. Lots of great questions to come. Jimmy, you wanted to just add something about what you said to Wendy before we went back to the phones, though.
Yeah, this is just an illustration of how there are some questions that the church hadn't clearly settled yet in this area. There was a reply in the first half of the 20th century that was issued by the then Holy Office. It's now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. A dubium, or doubt or question, was submitted by a bishop about a gentleman who was referred to by the privacy name Titius. Titius is a Latin man's name. And the bishop wrote in and he said, here's what Titius is doing. He had, while excluding all occult purpose from what he's doing, he'll sit down and he'll have a question about a set of questions for a loved one that has passed on, not necessarily his loved one, but someone's loved one. And he prays to God to allow him to have contact with that spirit, and then he takes a pen in his hand and he lets his hand write the answers to the questions he has, and he's excluding all purpose of any evil influence or any evil spirit. He doesn't want to talk to them, and the answers he gets back are all fully orthodox, and they're all in consonance with what you would expect from a departed Catholic spirit, saying things like, for example, my relatives need to have another mass said for me, or they need to pray for me more, or things like that. And so it's all orthodox answers. Is it okay for Titius to do this? And now this is normally when today it's the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. Normally when they answer a question like this from a bishop, they answer with a one-word reply. They say either affirmative, meaning the answer is yes, or they say negative, meaning the answer is no. And they do that over and over and over again. And so anytime they say anything other than affirmative or negative, it's significant. Now, this is the early 20th century, and this is the pre-Vatican II Holy Office. And so what do they say when they're asked about Titius using automatic write-in to contact the spirits of departed loved ones? They don't say affirmative, and they don't say negative. They come back and they say, not in the circumstances described. And that would suggest, so it's not a clear yes, it's not a clear no. That's an example of how the magisterium has not settled every question in this area, and the way they phrased it, not in the circumstances described, could suggest that this might be okay in some other circumstances. They don't say what those might be, but it does envision the possibility. So I'm being real careful here in trying to stick close to the texts of what the Catechism and what other church documents have actually said here, and point out that although there are clear warnings, there's often divination, there's often magic, and I would add there's often fraud. There are some areas that there's some gray zone that the church hasn't fully clarified yet.
Michael up next. Michael's in Michigan watching on YouTube. Michael, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good, thank you.
So my question is, were the Jewish people in the first century expecting a divine Messiah? And to kind of add to that, how can I show Jewish people that a divine Messiah isn't contrary to Judaism?
Okay, so the Jewish people in the time of Christ definitely were expecting a Messiah. The question is, what kind of Messiah? Would the Messiah be a heavenly figure like the Son of God, or would he just be an earthly human figure, a purely human Messiah? And the answer is that there were different opinions on this. In some traditions, the Messiah or Son of Man to use a parallel term, was envisioned as an ordinary human. But in other traditions, the Messiah was envisioned as a heavenly celestial figure. So it really depends on which group of first century Jews you're talking about. Some had an expectation for one kind of Messiah, some had an expectation for another kind of Messiah, some didn't know what the Messiah was going to be. When it comes to showing that a concept of a divine Messiah is not inconsistent with the Jewish faith, there are various passages that are suggestive of a celestial Son of Man, a celestial Messiah figure. One of those is in the book of Daniel, where Daniel has a vision of God in heaven. He refers to him here as the Ancient of Days, and he sees God seated on his throne in heaven in the clouds, and he's surrounded by his heavenly court, which is also seated on thrones. And then Daniel says, and up to God came one like a Son of Man riding on a cloud. And this is the basis for Jesus' own self-description of himself as the Son of Man. Now, in later Judaism, this Son of Man-like figure was interpreted in other ways. But in first century Judaism at the time of Christ and for a few centuries thereabout, it was often understood as the Son of Man was understood as a celestial figure, because he's not coming from earth. He's already riding on clouds. And riding on clouds is what God gets to do. And so there were Jews who looked at this figure and said, okay, this is some kind of divine figure. It's like a second Yahweh or a lesser Yahweh. And so the idea that there is more than one divine figure in heaven, and also the nations end up worshiping this Son of Man. So the idea that there's more than one heavenly figure that is deserving of worship became known in some Jewish circles, and at least this is the name that's applied to it today, as the two powers in heaven doctrine. And it's to this that Jesus refers when he's put on trial in front of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, in the Gospel of Mark. The high priest tells Jesus at one point, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed, meaning the Son of God? And he says, yes, and from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he's directly invoking Daniel's vision and applying it to himself. He's saying, I'm that dude. I'm the second Yahweh. I'm the second power in heaven. And it's at that point that the high priest he knows what he's saying. He tears his robes and says, you've heard the blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Well, it wasn't blasphemy to claim to be a human Messiah, to just be a son of David who was going to kick out the Romans and stuff. That's not blasphemy. That's prophecy. But in the high priest's eyes, he was not a believer in the two powers in heaven doctrine. And so he thought Jesus's endorsement of the two powers in heaven doctrine was blasphemy. But not all Jews from this period agreed with the high priest. There were Jews who did believe in the two powers in heaven doctrine. And so consequently, this is a strand in Jewish intellectual history, and thus the idea of a heavenly divine Messiah is not. This is one illustration of how a heavenly divine Messiah is consistent with certain Jewish understandings of the Messiah, although it's not all Jewish understandings of the Messiah. If you'd like more information about that, I would suggest going to schoolofapologetics.com, where I have a course called Evidence for Jesus, where I go through the different strands of Jewish interpretation of the Messiah and document them for you so you can see the source documents that they're coming from and have a deeper understanding of them.
Okay, Michael?
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. The number here, 888-318-7884. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything. If you've got a question you'd like to ask Jimmy, you are welcome to. You probably go to the top of the line if you say Master Jimmy Akin. That's the title he's going by today. But anyone is welcome. Anyone's welcome to ask their question. We're going to take a very quick break. Before we do, I'll remind you that all this year, throughout the entire year, anybody who joins Society 315 here at Catholic Answers receives the Hallow app and all kinds of wonderful stuff there on the Hallow app, and we'd love you to have it. All you have to do is go to casociety315.com. You could also just search the internet, Catholic Answers Society 315. When you become a member, we'd be delighted to give you a full year of the Hallow app. And we're delighted that we're among those who have materials there on the Hallow app available for you. But there's just an endless supply of wonderful stuff there, help you with your prayer and help you with your Catholic life. Just go to CA Society 315 and sign up. Jimmy Akin, our guest. He's the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Maybe you got a mystery you want to ask him about. Maybe you got something else you want to ask him about. It's all welcome, and we'll continue with it right after this on Catholic Answers Live. The word discipleship is often abused, and many Catholics are not even sure it applies to them. Well, it does, and in his new book, Real Discipleship, best-selling author Father Jeffrey Kirby helps you to separate true discipleship from false. A lively mix of theology, history, Bible study, and common sense, Real Discipleship is for anyone who wants to follow Jesus closely. Order your copy of Real Discipleship today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
What was the church like in its infancy? In a word, Catholic, and Joe Heschmeyer has the receipts. In his best-selling book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, he gives you the details from the historical records of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Right now, get a copy for just $10, plus free shipping if you live in the continental United States. Get more information and order The Early Church Was the Catholic Church at theearlychurchwascatholic.com.
Why do Catholics pray to dead people, bow to statues, venerate relics? And where do we find any of this stuff in the Bible? In the delightful book, The Saints Pray for You, Dr. Carlo Broussard convincingly defends the ancient Christian belief rooted in Scripture that the saints care for us, that they are allies. Order your copy of The Saints Pray for You today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
On the next More to Life, no go.
When is enough enough? We'll help you set better boundaries.
That's on the next More to Life. Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest this hour. And it's an Ask Me Anything, and all the lines are full. All of those things add up to me just going back to the phone. So here we go to Tom in Colorado Springs, Colorado, watching on YouTube. We're glad you're here, Tom. Go ahead with your question.
Hey, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
This is for Jimmy directly. Yeah, I'm going through a divorce right now. It's not my choice to do this. Yeah, I know. I married my wife about 5 years ago. We have 2 beautiful kids. And like I said, it's not my choice. It's her choice. We were both practicing Catholics before we met, during our engagement, during dating, and after we got married, too. To my knowledge, she's still a practicing Catholic, too, and yet she's seeking a divorce. I do understand that the Catholic Church allows one to seek a civil divorce for various reasons. I do not think that our marriage meets any of those reasons at all. And I guess since I don't want one because I believe in the validity of my sacrament and her promise to it, my promise to it, and the covenant that we entered, I don't really understand why I can't ask the church to intervene well before we get to the annulment process. I do not believe this marriage is annulable. And I guess I'm also a little concerned that even when we get to the annulment, if we get there in the first place, that I'm not really going to get a good defense at that, because from my understanding, there's a lot of vague interpretations of canon law these days. So yeah, I mean, I don't know why I can't go to a church authority and say, hey, this is happening to me. Can you step in here and defend the sacrament instead of just waiting to the annulment process? Yeah. But like, people tell me that the bishops won't do that for me. I don't know if that's true or not, but the bishops are very hesitant to do that for me.
Well, so have you actually asked this question?
I've asked it to the priest in my diocese close to the bishop.
Okay.
And they said it's very unlikely that the bishop will help me with that.
Yeah. Do you personally know the bishop?
I don't, but I don't understand why that's a quality. Shouldn't the bishop, like, isn't that a canon law thing that they're kind of bound to? I'm not quite sure if it is or not, but isn't that a canon law thing that they're bound to advocate for that sacrament?
Well, they're bound to uphold the integrity of the sacrament when it's challenged, but that's different than providing marital counseling. You know, I mean, if you think about what would be involved in this. Now, I'm not making excuses here. I'm just explaining as best I can the human reality of the situation. The bishop, I gather, does not know you, does not know your wife. He doesn't know your backgrounds. Now, you can brief him on that, but he would have to come up to speed on your individual situation and form his own judgment about it, which might or might not agree with yours. He might agree with your wife.
Right.
But you're asking him to invest time. Now, it's reasonable for the faithful in a diocese to expect their bishop to invest some reasonable amount of time in them as individuals, but the more people he has under his care, the less that amount of time is going to be. And, you know, if he's got thousands of people in his diocese, and you think about how many of those people are likely to get divorces over the course of their lives, he may have so many people that if he tried to do this for everybody, he would do nothing else but this, you know, which would then deprive him of the office of functioning as a bishop. He's got other things he needs to do as a bishop, not just investigating marriage situations personally and providing counseling and stuff like that. Typically, I would expect not a bishop to do this function, but a priest, you know, especially the pastor of the two people who would presumably know them better and not require the extreme learning curve that a bishop would require. Even then, a lot of parishes are ginormous, and the pastor may not know everybody personally. So I think similar considerations could apply to a pastor. If I were in the situation, by the way, I meant to say I'm very sorry to hear about this, and I'll definitely be praying for it. And I'd encourage the listeners to pray for the situation as well, both for you and your wife and for everybody who's in similar situations, because these are painful situations. Having said that, if I were in such a situation and wanted to try to get some church intervention, I would approach my pastor, not the bishop. Even then, though, I would do so not with an expectation of course this is going to happen, because it may not be reasonable for the pastor either. In addition to the coming up to speed problem and forming a judgment problem as an outsider, there's another factor complicating the situation too, which is that if both parties were saying we want to work this out and we just need some counseling to help us work this out or help us see if we can work it out, well, I would say the priest still might refer you to a professional marriage counselor. But I would think the odds would be greater that a priest, either personally or through an assistant like an associate pastor or a deacon, might try to help out in that situation. But if one party is unwilling, I think the odds of ecclesiastical or church intervention go down, because the church has to care for everybody involved in this situation. And that means not taking sides. because if the there's you and your wife and your 2 children. Okay, let's suppose the church came into this situation and took your side and said, you guys need to stay together, and your wife is unwilling to do so. They would just alienate the church. They would alienate your wife from the church. If they came down hard and said, you need to stay together, and your wife was unwilling to do that for whatever reason, they just alienated her. And if she gets custody of those kids, or to the extent she gets effective custody of them, even if she doesn't have it all the time, it would also potentially alienate those children from the church. On the other hand, let's suppose that the church came into the situation and intervened and said, your wife is right. You guys should break up. Well, that would alienate you from the church. And to the extent that you have custody or effective custody of the children, it could also alienate the children from the church. And so in order to do the most good to the most souls, the church largely needs to remain neutral with respect to disputes of this nature, and let the parties, assist the parties when they ask for help. So like if you asked for your pastor's prayers, you asked him to give you some counseling or help you find a counselor, I'm sure he'd be happy to do that. But when you're talking about the church intervening directly in the situation and trying to achieve a particular outcome that is not desired by one of the participants, the church is going to have a much harder time intervening, because it needs to look to the long-term good of all of the souls involved and try not to alienate any of them from the church. So between the learning curve issue and the alienation issue, I can understand why a bishop or a pastor would say, given that, the parties are not all wanting to make this work out, I think we need to step back from this and keep it in prayer and offer what assistance we can that is desired by the parties, but not try to force a situation, not try to force assistance on someone who doesn't want it. And so that's how I would tend to look at the situation. I hope that's helpful, Tom. And like I said, it's a really tough situation. I will be praying for it, and I encourage others to pray for it as well.
Thank you, Tom. We'll take a break. Right back with more Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
This is Father Gerald Murray. Catholic truth conveyed through the radio reaches so many, both Catholic and non-Catholic, and they receive encouragement, strength, guidance, and enlightenment. The Holy Spirit is working through these radio waves that go out to all the countries of the world. Catholic radio, of course, is an effort to make Christ known.
The world needs EWTN Catholic Radio, now more than ever.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. And as you would expect with Jimmy here, lines have stayed full, so lots of calls to get to still. It's Ask Me Anything. Michael is in San Antonio, Texas, listening on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Michael, go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
Thank y'all for taking my call.
Sure.
So is animal predation a consequence of original sin?
Well, the church has no teaching on this, so there is a difference of opinion. Some individuals think that when mankind fell, that it affected the natural world, such that animals that were not predators became predators. Prior to the fall, or in the absence of the fall, they would have been vegetarians on this view. Some, like Hans Urs von Balthasar, would propose that, well, there never was a time when animals weren't predators, but they are still predators because of the fall. So, like, the human race fell, and that had kind of an effect on our whole timeline, so that even though there was never a time when animals were not predators, like, we see from dinosaurs predating each other and stuff, that it's still because of the fall. On the other hand, there is another opinion, which is advocated, among others, by St. Thomas Aquinas. And I'm not a Thomist, but I agree with St. Thomas here. The nature of animals did not change because of the fall. So in Aquinas' view, those animals which are predators were always predators and would have been predators even if man had never fallen, because there is what Genesis says is that human death entered the world through the fall. It doesn't say anything about animal death. And so, in Aquinas' view, lions did not used to eat straw like oxen. Lions were always obligate carnivores the way they are now. And the more we've learned about the biology of lions, which are obligate carnivores, they have to eat meat. They can't eat anything but meat, except in maybe very small quantities. The more we've learned about their biology, they are just configured to eat meat. They do not have the physical systems that oxen do that would allow them to eat plants. And so they basically wouldn't be lions if you reconfigured their biology to be herbivores. So I agree with St. Thomas Aquinas. Those animals that are predators were always predators, and their nature did not change because of the fall. But that is my opinion. Other people have other opinions.
And I am going to leave that there, Michael, because I would like to try to get as many on as I can before we have to end. Jimmy Akin, our guest. John's in Dallas, Texas, watching on YouTube. Glad you're here, John. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, I just have a question on Scripture currently. I'm reading about the 12 tribes and, currently how the U.S. is always wanting to protect Israel. Is that specific tribe Judah out there currently? And should we feel the need to protect them?
Okay, so in regard to the first question, the identities of the Jewish tribes has largely been lost in history. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that there are certain tribal affiliations that can be identified in a probabilistic way. So, for example, if someone identifies as a Jew, and and by the way, this has nothing to do with biology, or not nothing, but it's not strictly tied to biology, because you could become a Jew in the ancient world by conversion. And you could convert and join one of the tribes, and they would retroactively adopt you into the line of the tribe, so you would become a member of the tribe of Judah, even if you were born an Egyptian or a Roman or whatever else. So don't think of this just in terms of genes being passed down. It's a religious, ethnic identity that is passed down through more than just genetic means. So having said that, most Jews today are descendants legally, biologically, or at least legally, of the tribe of Judah. However, mixed in with those that are biologically the descendants of the tribe of Judah, there also are Jews that would be descendants of the tribe of Simeon, because Judah absorbed the tribe of Simeon early on. And also there will be Jews who are descendants of the tribe of Benjamin, because the distinction between Judahites and Benjaminites later got lost. However, within the group of people who identify as Jews, there are also some who appear to have maintained an identity indicating that they are not descendants of Judah or Simeon or Benjamin, but Levi. Traditionally, it is regarded that if a Jewish person has a last name like Levi or Levitt, that they are descendants of the tribe of Levi. Also, if they have a last name like Cohen, which is the Hebrew word for priest, Kohen, then they are also a descendant of the tribe of Levi, because they the priests were all members of the tribe of Levi. So if someone's a priest, they're automatically a Levite. Then in Galilee, we have the Samaritans, and the Samaritans are descendants not of Judah, but of the northern tribes, most particularly the tribe of Ephraim. And so there's some Ephraimite tribal identity that is maintained as well. But broadly speaking, the distinction between the tribes has been lost, except for the things I just named. So that should hopefully answer your first question, John. Your second question was, do we have to support them? Well, no. You don't have to support people just because of who their ancestors were. Now, we want to pray for our Jewish brethren, and it may be advisable, even beneficial, to do what we can to help them out in a wide variety of situations. As God told Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. So there can be benefits to helping out the Jewish people. Having said that, that does not mean that that they have a right to their current nation state. That's something Catholics can have different opinions on. Also, it doesn't mean we have to advocate or support Israel in any particular policy that they choose to adopt. The policy may be good, the policy may be bad. And if it's good to support it. If it's bad, it's good not to support it. So we can't get out of the difficult process of making practical historical decisions about morality and adopt a help the Jews every single time, no exceptions, Israel, love it or leave it, or a reject and harm the Jews in every situation. We have to use discernment and moral judgment to figure out what are good policies, what are bad policies, what's possible, what's not possible, and try to achieve the most good that's possible.
Again, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to keep trying to get folks on with Jimmy, but thank you very much, John, for the question. This is Blaze right here in El Cajon, California, watching on YouTube. Blaze, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I was calling because my fiance is in RCIA right now, and she was baptized as a Protestant, so she's making her profession of faith. But I was just wondering if there's any urgency for her to go to confession, because they told us that she could go to confession now, but if she did, she wouldn't receive absolution. And I was kind of confused when they told me that. And I guess the plan is for them to go during the Lenten service, because she does need some absolution before she receives confirmation, is my understanding.
Yep.
Since she's not being baptized.
Okay, I would be at a loss to explain what they told you. If one is not going to confession if there's not an absolution. One might, voluntarily go and say, just as an exercise in accountability or, therapy, one might go and say, well, I did this and I'm trying to struggle to overcome this. But that's not confession if there's no absolution. If there's no absolution, it is not the sacrament of confession. It's something else. So at a minimum, I would say if they said she can go to confession, but she can't be absolved, they are confused. Because if it's what it sounds like to me is they're expecting to have candidates for reception into the church go to confession closer to the time of their reception, and they do need to do that. If they've never been to confession and they have committed any mortal sins in their life, they need to get right on those before they're confirmed. And before they receive the Eucharist for the first time. So that does need to happen. And they may have just as a parish adopted a policy of we do this closer to the time of reception. However, and this is Canon 844 in the Code of Canon Law. If you want to look it up, it's online. But in Canon 844, the Code of Canon Law, it specifies that those who are Protestant, like your, I think, fiance, you said,
yes,
those who are Protestant are able to receive 3 sacraments: confession, the anointing of the sick, and the Eucharist, if there is danger of death or other grave necessity, and they ask for it on their own and so forth. So if your girlfriend or your fiance found it difficult to remain in sin, like if it was a burden on her, I mean, God forbid she gets into danger of death, but assuming she doesn't get into danger of death, if it was a burden on her to not go to confession until closer to time of reception, she could go to confession now under the provisions of Canon 844 as a Protestant. She could say, look, it's really a burden for me to be able to not be absolved. I really want to be absolved faster. And so I'd like to go to confession now under these provisions of Canon 844.
I'm going to, again, leave that there and try to get as many on as I can before we have to go. That means heading up to Omaha, Nebraska, where Ken is listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Ken, if you could be quick with your question, we could probably get you an answer.
Okay, I'm basically a new Catholic. I came in about 5 years ago.
Okay.
And the one thing I have trouble understanding is during the Mass, just before we say the Our Father, the priest uses the phrase "we dare to say," and I've always wondered, why do we dare to say the Our Father? That's my question.
Well, so that's what the English translation in front of the priest says he's supposed to say, and I'd have to look up the Latin to see, is there a special nuance to the word that may not be captured in the English translation? But just taking the English translation for what it is, I would say that that essentially we dare to say means we have the confidence to say. There also may be an additional connotation, and this is why I'd want to check the Latin, but there also may be an additional connotation whose function is to highlight our dependence on God's mercy. The idea is not that God's not going to be merciful to us or that we have anything to be afraid of in saying the Our Father, but by saying, we dare to say could be understood to mean we're not actually worthy to talk to God, and it's by His grace that we get to talk to Him. It's by His mercy. There's an act of mercy in God listening to us sinners, because He doesn't have to, but He chooses to because He's merciful. And so by phrasing it in these terms, it's a way of reminding us of just how dependent we are on God's mercy. Now, He is a merciful God. He wants us to pray to Him. He wants us to pray the Our Father to Him. That's why He taught it to us. So we're doing God's will here, but it can be helpful to be reminded of, we kind of are still sinners and we really are dependent on God's mercy. And so, it's another way of saying we're not worthy, but by God's mercy, we say the Our Father together. So that's how I would interpret the phrase.
And I will leave the interpretation there, Ken. God bless you. Thank you very much for the call. Sorry for those callers we did not get to, but we are coming down to the end. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World drops each Friday, each Monday. The Jimmy Akin podcast drops, and so coming up on Friday. So again, this Friday, the one looking
Part
forward.
One of USS Hornet.
The USS Hornet. Did you say spooky or suspicious, or what's a good modifier
Mysterious.
for mysterious? All right, a mysterious episode for Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World coming up on Friday. Hey, thanks very much for being with us. I don't want you to forget, we've got that Fat February book sale. I don't know why it's called Fat February, but it is a Fat February book sale, $10 book sale, more than 100 books, ebooks on sale. Just head over to shop.catholic.com and look for the sale. All kinds of great deals on books. That will do it for us. We will see you tomorrow, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.